So to misquote the Black Panther Party for self-defense, working class people have three major enemies: demagogue politicians, avaricious businessmen, and dirty fucking pigs. So this session is on the dirty fucking pigs. So it's Austerity, Policing and the Crisis. We've got three speakers. I'm Tom Fowler. I'm host of the Spike Ups podcast. I campaign against undercover policing into political protest groups. Joined with Shanice and Avia, who are co-authors of Abolition, Revolution, which is that book you can see there, which highly recommend you buy. Read it as well. And Griff Ferris, who is a campaigner against policing and involved in cop watch. So Shanice, we'll start.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I actually wanted to begin by exploring something that was recently on Navarro Live and said by Michael Walker. And he described abolition as a politics of, quote, left-wing culture wars. So I wanted to interrogate and use this opportunity to interrogate what he might have meant by that. And culture wars typically are used to describe a political environment defined primarily by social groups vying for dominance. And in the UK, the culture wars is characterised by an ever-escalating narrative in opposition to social progress, based on fear and hatred of historically marginalised groups of people. And they're often narratives that are lacking in intellectual vigour, evidence bases, empiricism, and that often play on reactionary and ignorant instincts. And they're used by politicians as diversionary tactics to avoid interrogation of what is seemingly the unsolvable crisis of capitalism. So this is how I would describe the culture wars. So presumably, what Michael meant by that was that abolition is some kind of left-wing version of a reactionary politics that has no evidence base and is probably maybe generally a bad idea. Utterly detached from reality. This is kind of the typical critique of abolition that you get. The reality, presumably, according to him, is that police and prisons work well, perhaps. Play an important role in society for ordinary people, maybe. And so, I guess for him, it might be unimaginable, or simply a terrible idea that we might explore the abolition of these institutions. So I'm here to present the diametrically opposed position. I'm here to present an empirical, evidence-based position of why abolition is the future that we should be working and moving towards. So I want to do that by interrogating the actual role and function of policing and prisons in society, and just asking a really basic question, which is, do they work at their stated aims? The stated aims of policing and prisons is to protect people, to keep them safe, to punish people who have done bad things. So let's discuss and let's work out, is it successful at those stated aims? So I want to start with a topic that isn't really discussed that often, which is car chases. And Audrey Farrell, who wrote an incredible book, Police, Crime and Corruption, really interrogated, it was a bit of time ago, we're going to need to update those statistics, but did a really seminal interrogation of police car chases and asked the question, do police car chases actually get police to crimes in time to stop the crime from taking place? And the answer is emphatically no. And in fact, when she analysed police car chases and how police interact with car chases, often it's seen as kind of like the fun bit of the job, the thing that gets you away from the monotony of admin at the desk. You know, it's the thing that you're kind of excited about when you're on a long shift. But does it actually get police to crimes in order for them to intervene or stop them from happening? No, they don't work. But what they do is have deadly consequences. So we know about the story of Henry Hicks in Islington, who was killed after a police car chase. We know about Ronaldo Johnson in Manchester, who was killed after a police car chase. We know about the recent case in Wales, where the police lied multiple times until they got caught on CCTV about two young boys, Kyrie Sullivan and Harvey Evans, again killed after a police car chase. So we know that statistically speaking, police car chases don't work at getting police to crimes faster. And you'll have known this from your own lived experience. If a burglary happens, I know when my house was burgled and the person got in and there was blood all over my house, and it was days before the police turned up. Even though we kind of, when the incident happened, it was live. So that's one area in which policing doesn't work. And, you know, the current Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Peter Rowley, who's being touted as this kind of big reformer, is actually working with the Home Office to change the accountability system so that police who are charged under kind of motorist regulations and dangerous driving regulations that kind of leads to kind of death on the roads or injury on the roads, they're less likely to be charged. So he's trying to bring in changes in legislation that will lead to less accountability. So let's move away from car chases, let's look at mental health interventions. I don't really need to say anything about this because the police have already admitted that they're really shit at responding to people in mental health crisis. And there's actually going to be a new bit of guidance that's coming out from the Metropolitan Police in November about the fact that they're actually pulling away from responding to mental health crises. Do I need a mic? Okay, yeah. So the Metropolitan Police have themselves admitted that they're shit at responding to mental health crises and are going to be working and collaborating with the NHS so that they don't respond to those calls. But I think it's still important to point out how bad they are at responding to mental health crises. So Kingsley Burrell, a black man from Birmingham, called the police on himself because he was experiencing mental health crisis and wanted help. He ended up dead after being restrained by police officers. We know about the recent case of the Chelsea Bridge case, Oladeji Omoshore, who was supposedly wielding a screwdriver that turned out to not be a screwdriver, and he was tasered, and in his fear and fright, going through that mental health crisis, threw himself off Chelsea Bridge and died. And of course there is the kind of the powerful and seminal case of Marcia Rigg's brother, Sean Rigg, who was restrained by 8 police officers going through mental health crisis at Brixton Police Station, and he died. And his mural outside of Brixton Police Station is regularly vandalised. We know that black men are 7 times more likely to die as a result of police restraint, according to research from inquests. And we know that over the past 12 years, deaths in custody have doubled. That's despite the fact that over the past few years, there's been more scrutiny on policing. Even within the context of more scrutiny and more calls for reform, black men and other people are still dying at the hands of these state officials. And we know that of those deaths over the last 12 years, all but 2 of them involved drug and alcohol, and nearly half of them involved mental health. And the reason why I point that out is because what I'll go on to later is there's clearly alternative ways of dealing with these questions, but the fundamental one that I want to explore for the moment now is that clearly policing isn't working. Because should people who need help be ending up dead? And I'd assume that all of you would answer no to that question. You know, I use this example quite often, but if you took paracetamol and 98.4% of the time you ended up dead, we might say, paracetamol doesn't work, it's a bad thing, right? Yeah? If that was the case, probably wouldn't be something that we, used and took every day and thought was a good thing. Why is it then that 98.4% of people who are reported for rape, there is no charge? This is before you even talk about unreported cases or prosecutions. How can we live in a system where rape is essentially decriminalised and we call that a system that works? Does that work? For me, the answer is no. In this context, only 1 police officer has ever been successfully prosecuted for manslaughter, and that was in the case of Darlian Atkinson, the footballer, who was kicked across the head multiple times by police officers, despite the fact that we've had nearly 2,000 deaths in custody since the 90s. Is this a system that works? The people who are charged with enforcing accountability are themselves not accountable. Is this a system that works? I'm going to say no. So let's talk about prisons now. Because often the critique is that, well, it doesn't make sense for there to not be prisons in society. It's an absurd idea, the notion of kind of abolishing prisons. Well, what the abolitionist asks is not whether an idea is absurd or not, because I wasn't born, but there was a time where votes for women was absurd, or abolishing slavery was absurd. So the first question for me is not, is something scary? The question for me is it going to work? Or does the current thing work? So let's ask that question. Do prisons work? So, we know that of the offences that people are in prison for, around 50% are crimes against the person. So that's, GHB, sexual violence, domestic violence. And then around 50% are crimes not against the person. So that's your kind of robberies, your thefts, your drugs, sex work, those sorts of offences. So let's kind of look at those two categories. Because absolutely understandably, when someone experiences some kind of bodily harm, they want the person who did that harm to be punished. But what we also know is that when people go into prisons and come out for the kind of most serious forms of violence against women, domestic violence, they have the highest recidivism rates. So people go into prison, they come out, they do it again. If they go back into prison, they're more likely to do it again. And the most serious acts of violence against women have the highest levels of recidivism after someone's been in prison. Is this a system that works, where people go in and come out and do the same thing again? Let's look at it in a different perspective. Let's look at kind of drug users and people going in for drug offences. We know that if you go into prison with an opiate addiction and you come out, you're 7 times more likely, according to research from KCL, to die of an overdose. Why would you put someone in that cage if they're then going to come out and be more likely to experience harm? Again, I'll put it to you guys. Is that working? We know that women in prisons, around 45% of women in prisons have experienced some form of childhood abuse or domestic and sexual violence. Why is it that some of the most vulnerable people are having their vulnerability multiplied and multiplied and multiplied again and again by state institutions? Are these systems that are really working for the most vulnerable people? And in fact, with a lot of these offences that people are in prisons for, in particular drugs, theft, robbery, and weapons possession, there are provable, workable, alternative solutions. Let's take one of the toughest ones, knife crime. Now, in London, the response that you get to knife crime is the siege of black communities by over-policing, so stop and search, patrols, arrests, etc. I want to take us to Glasgow, because in Glasgow, they took a public health approach to youth violence, where, I quote, they had the police at arm's length. So they reduced the capacity of the police to intervene in youth violence offences. And instead, the approach that they took was working with people who are identified as being at risk of youth violence and intervening before it got to the stage of them harming or being harmed on the streets. They did that with mental health support, educational opportunities and vocational opportunities, and early intervention for domestic violence in the home, because we know that there is a clear link between domestic violence in the home and street and youth violence on the streets. And what happened? Here's some evidence for the doubters. A statistically significant reduction in youth violence on Glasgow streets, with an approach that had the police at arm's length, an abolitionist approach, essentially, or a quasi-abolitionist approach, because they did work with the police in kind of the worst case scenarios, but it was a kind of arm's length, that's the kind of last resort sort of thing. So that's evidence for you that we don't need police to actually have workable solutions to cure and to fight harm and violence in society. We know that consumption rooms, where people are allowed to safely use substances they're addicted to, and through those spaces are then connected to support networks, work at A, reducing overdoses, and B, supporting people through recovery. We know that sticking them in prisons kills them. We know that jobs, healthcare, and education work to getting people away from cycles of harm and violence. We know that sticking them in prisons where they come out and don't have access to housing or where their record means they're less likely to get a job, doesn't work. And in fact, we know that prisons are incredibly violent places where people in there often experience violence not only from each other, but also if we look at the case of Sarah Reid, where she ended up dead in Holloway Prison from the institution itself, through neglect, through not giving her the medication and access to her mental health support that she needed, as she was severely traumatised, having had to carry her dead baby from a hospital to the moratorium. So, largely, these institutions empirically do not work for the most vulnerable people in society, i.e. the working class. And what is ironic is when Michael Walker went on one of his other diatribes about abolition, it was at Glastonbury, which is in itself an example of an alternative approach to drug use, because it's an environment where white middle-class people are allowed to take drugs knowing that there's not going to be any police intervention, and where that's agreed between the councils and the police and the organisers. It's an abolitionist space. So it's ironic for people to be levelling uneducated critiques within a space in which police aren't present whilst you're taking drugs in the first place. Moving on. So the question that I want to ask is actually, as an abolitionist, how can we reduce the harm that exists in society and within the very institutions that are tasked with keeping us safe? What can we replace them with? And this is the difficult question, but what can we replace them with? What solutions are on offer that could potentially work? And so I want to bring some of those to you today. Because we know that when the police were formed in 1829, the Metropolitan Police, the first state-funded police in the world, we know that they weren't formed under the guise of protecting and serving. They were formed under the guise of coercing and controlling and subduing the revolutionary class potential of the working class at that time. So they were never from the very beginning invented to protect ordinary people. Quite the opposite. So what could alternatives look like? So there's a lot of detail that we can go into, but one of the things that we know is that, for example, for violence against women, the actual first responders are never state institutions. The actual first responders in a case of sexual domestic violence are usually neighbours, strangers, or family members. So this here tells us that here is an opportunity for us to think differently about how we respond to, violence against women. Are there ways, and there are some abolitionist communities that are practicing this, locally in spaces, how can we empower local communities to have the collective resources and strength to be able to respond when they hear or observe, violence against women happening? And then more broadly, how can we have the resources that we need within a community so that a woman can leave safely? Because we in Sisters Uncut had a phrase, how can she get away when she has nowhere to stay? So that can kind of offer us routes to looking at alternatives. Public health approach to knife crime, as evidenced in Glasgow, can give us some routes to alternatives. We know that we have yet to see what the Metropolitan Police and the NHS are going to come up with regards to mental health, but some ideas that abolitionists have been thinking about and practicing, particularly in the US, are mental health first responders. So instead of there being a police officer that responds to someone in mental health crisis, you've got a professional who's been trained in mental health first aid, de-escalation, to respond to someone in mental health crisis, but the key thing is they're not empowered to use force. And actually, I've worked in homelessness services where I, as a worker, wasn't empowered to use force, but I would never once, in my 7.5 years, got assaulted by one of my clients, because we have tools that we can use to support and de-escalate. So the question that abolitionists asked is, well, how can we give everyone those tools? How can we give local communities those tools to respond, to de-escalate? And then more broadly, what services can exist to then support, to then take those people on? Because we know that our mental health services have been decimated, and then we ask, why is it that police are having to then respond to more and more mental health people in mental health crises? Instead of arresting sex workers or substance users or dealers, low-level dealers, or people involved in other underground economies, why don't we cut off the blood supply to the violence that those people experience which is the blood supply is, by the way, criminalisation. Criminalisation creates underground markets, and underground markets are run on the principle of violence. Let's do something bold and creative. Let's cut off that blood supply at the root, criminalisation. Let's decriminalise and actually give people alternative routes to recovery, or if they want, out of sex work. And this is the places where these things have been tried and tested with success. So, and I'll end on this, and again, it is referencing something that Michael Walker said. He spoke recently in another episode of Novara Live about thefts in supermarkets increasing. And he made the good point that thefts in supermarkets are increasing, but not in some wild or wacky way. They're kind of just gone back to before pre-pandemic levels. But what I wanted to draw out is he talked about an example, a case of a man who, in retaliation, after he got caught stealing in a supermarket, he came back to the supermarket with a knife. And obviously that was really scary for the workers. And Michael Walker made the point that police would be needed to intervene in that kind of scenario. And just to be clear, abolitionists aren't stupid people. Obviously we need, if someone's running around waving a knife, not necessarily police, but we need some kind of organised collective response that's going to keep people safe and de-escalate that situation. That's obvious. Nobody would say otherwise. But the fundamental question that he didn't ask, and that he completely missed, is what is actually driving that guy to be running around waving a knife in the first place, and to be, habitually stealing from supermarkets? And that is the sensible question that abolitionists ask, which is, what is the root of violence? What is the root of harm? What is the driving forces? What is the cause? And how can we intervene at that root level? That's a sensible question to ask. A not sensible question to ask is, well, how can we reform an institution that hasn't worked for 200 years? That's not a sensible question. So to end, I would argue we're getting to almost stages of conspiracy theory with this idea that policing works. Because at almost every avenue you look at it, violence against women, youth violence, mental health, theft, robbery, crimes against a person, it doesn't work. And similarly, when you look at prisons, not working. So abolition is about asking those really tough, hard questions about what does society needs to look like for people to not have to wake up every day in places like Tottenham or Handsworth, where I'm from, and be afraid that their brother's going to get stabbed. Because the answer clearly hasn't for 200 years been calling police. It's asking the serious questions about, well, how can we move away from a society of violence to a society of care and collective responsibility and communal resource? And I think for me, these are the evidence-based and empirical questions, the sensible questions to be asked, not the continuing the conspiracy that policing works, that some liberals seem incredibly attached to. So I'm going to end there, because it was quite spicy. But yeah, I hope that was useful.
Okay, so, Avia, sorry.
That's all right.
How did you become an abolitionist?
Is this what
Yeah,
works? Yeah, it feels really low. I kind of want to add on to some of the stuff that Shanice was very eloquently speaking about. And, one of the things that I think is a fair enough question is around, lots of people in society are not abolitionists and not necessarily thinking about, abolishing the police in the way I'm thinking about it. And I wasn't always an abolitionist. So I kind of wanted to share a little bit about how I became an abolitionist through my organising with Sisters Uncut, and why I ended up there, and where I started off. So one pivotal thing that happened to me when I was a kid that really shaped a lot of why I do what I do is, so I grew up in a council estate in East London. And on my council estate where I lived, my best friend's mum, when I was about 9 years old, was murdered by her dad. And I don't talk about this in loads of detail. I reference it sometimes in terms of my journey, but I don't talk about it in loads of detail. So Mandy was her name, my best friend's mum. She had long ginger hair that she always wore up in a scrunchie. And the day before she was murdered, she was going around the estate asking for signatures from people on the estate to try and get a playground for the children on the estate. And the next day she was murdered. And it was an extremely painful and traumatic event. I never saw my best friend after that. She went into care. And I was left with a lot of unanswered questions about what had happened, why it happened, and not really knowing what to do. And a few years later, when I was about 16, I actually bumped into the man who murdered Mandy. He only spent 3 years in prison. And at that time, I was vexed and confused and angry about why that was, why he'd spent so little time in prison. I thought he should be rotted in jail forever. And by that time, I'd also had my own life, my own family turned upside down because of domestic violence. I'd spent about a year and a half living in refuges, bed and breakfast with my family because of my own family's experiences of domestic violence. And so at that point, I was thinking, you should be rotted in jail. You took Mandy from us and you should be rotted in jail. And it was through my experiences that later on, I decided that I wanted to work in the domestic violence sector. That I wanted to take the experiences that I had, the trauma that I had, and I wanted to contribute to stopping anything like that happening to anyone else. And by the time that I got to the domestic violence sector, I was seeing massive cuts, austerity, left, right, and centre. So the conversations that I was having with survivors of domestic violence were conversations like, if you want to leave, this violent situation, you may be living in a council flat. I have to also be real with you that you may not get another council flat, but it may save your life. You may leave this violent relationship, and so you've got to weigh up your options there, which it's almost impossible to have to give up your chance of having safe, secure housing for the rest of your life, or face the possibility of staying and being murdered by a perpetrator. Those are the kinds of conversations that I was having every day. And that's what motivated me to start organising with Sisters Uncut in 2014, and Shanice joined not long afterwards. We wanted to confront those cuts. I wanted to make sure that what happened to Mandy never happened to anyone else again. I wanted to make sure that what happened to my family, the homelessness, the disruption, never happened to anyone else again, and yet it was getting worse. What I was seeing was, it wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. The cuts to legal aid, the cuts to housing, the cuts to domestic violence services, all of that, it was the things that you need when and we know that the point of when you decide to leave a violent relationship, that is the most dangerous point, that is the most deadly point. So that is when those resources matter the most. The housing, the legal aid, the support, the benefits, all of that was all being taken away. And that's what motivated me to join Sisters Uncut. And initially, what we were trying to do with our organising, with our actions, was highlight that. We understood what the state was doing was perpetrating harm by taking an ideological stance to take away those lifelines, to withdraw those lifelines. We understood that the state was a perpetrator in that sense. There was an ideological decision. They took a decision to take away the things that people needed to survive. And so we used stunts and direct action like dyeing the fountains of at Trafalgar Square red to kind of show that the state had blood in its hands. We crashed the red carpet at the premiere of the film Suffragette with the tagline, "Dead women can't vote." We wanted to make it clear that the fight for women, for justice, for gender justice, wasn't over with the vote. You can't vote if you're dead. And that's what we were facing, and that's what we were trying to turn around. And that, also turned into organising around actual domestic violence services that were facing being shut down. So in Portsmouth, in Doncaster, using some of these tactics that we were learning along the way to try and actually keep services open on the ground. And sometimes that worked. But we often found that a year later, we were back to the drawing board where those services were being faced with cuts again. And there was a bit of a turning point. Shanice mentioned Sarah Reid, a black woman who'd experienced a lot of state violence, who had been beaten by police. Shanice outlined what happened to her, disgusting what happened to her around her baby, and she ended up, perhaps not surprisingly, in a psychiatric unit. And in that psychiatric unit, she was sexually assaulted by another patient. But how that was interpreted was that she was the aggressor. So she was taken to Holloway, where she later died and found with ligatures around her neck. And Sisters Uncut threw our weight behind the family justice campaign that was led by her mum Marilyn. We actually dedicated the book Abolition, Revolution to her, because this was a real turning point in a lot of our politics and how we understood the state and how we understood policing and how we understood gendered violence. Not long after Sarah Reid died, it was announced that Holloway Prison was to be closed down. And we decided, people in the community around Holloway decided that they wanted that space to be put to public good. The things that people in communities ask for, things like housing, things like a space, a community space, they wanted a women's building. These are the things that communities generally need. These are the things that they ask for. They didn't want a prison, they wanted social housing, and they wanted a women's building to organise community need out of. And Sisters Uncut North London Sisters Uncut threw their weight behind that campaign. Decided to go into the now, by that point, closed Holloway Prison, occupy it, turn it into a women's space, and start to use it to reimagine what we can do with that space. And that's, it's around this time that our politics started to shift and change, and the way in which we were analysing the state was starting to change. Because what happened to Sarah Reid, she was interpreted as being the aggressor when she was the victim. And this is what we weren't only seeing that in her situation, this was across the board. When we were fighting to end cuts to domestic violence services, it's not that money just disappeared, it's that money was being rerouted into the criminal justice system. That the government was making and the state was making an ideological choice not to fund housing, not to fund legal aid, not to fund childcare, not to fund benefits, not to fund any of the things that survivors say they need to survive, but to put it into the criminal justice system to try and get more perpetrators locked up. And that is why we were also seeing a load of survivors being arrested and a load of survivors being locked up. And what we started to understand and question, even though loads of people, pretty much everyone in Sisters Uncut is a survivor of some kind of gendered violence, has experienced some kind of gendered violence. And lots of people, lots of us, have gone through that feeling of wanting revenge against the perpetrator, of wanting them to rot in jail. And so it was quite confronting to be asking these questions. Well, if we give in the state, if we're invested in the state deciding who's the perpetrator and who the victim is, where is that leaving us? We're seeing survivors being arrested for defending themselves against perpetrators, or being arrested because of their immigration status, because their immigration status is prioritised over and above the abuse they've experienced. We're seeing sex workers being arrested because that's more important than the fact that you're trying to report a rape. So if we're giving the state the power to decide who's the perpetrator and who the survivor is, often they're actually deciding the people that we're trying to support and help, that we're trying to change, help support to survive. Actually, it's been decided that actually they're the wrongdoer, they're going to be criminalised, they're going to be punished. And wider than that, zooming out from that, we started to understand that actually, societally, what we're seeing is those kinds of investment in criminal justice system to deal with gendered violence isn't happening across the board. It's disproportionately impacting poor, working class, black and brown communities. Those are the people that are being punished, and it's perpetuating harm. It's perpetuating violence and it's perpetuating trauma, just like it did in the case of Sarah Reid. And so this is when we started to question whether or not we really wanted to keep investing in a criminal justice-like response to domestic violence and gendered violence. And I've said that not long after the Holloway prison was announced to be closed, we occupied that space and tried to turn it into something that the community could, bring out ideas of what the community wanted that space to be, wanted the prison to be. And I was talking about the difficult decision that we took to kind of go into a more abolitionist politics. And one of the questions, we were asking is like, okay, well, what is the alternative? And Shanice spoke a little bit about this as well. And at this point, I kind of want to ask, thinking back to what happened on my estate and in my family, what if our community had been given the resources to support and protect Mandy when she was going through domestic violence? And everyone in the estate knew that she was going through domestic violence, but no one really knew what to do. All the women were heartbroken that no police officer ever asked them anything about what was going on after she was murdered. No prosecutor ever asked them to ever say anything. She was a much loved member of the community. And imagine if the people on my estate had the control over housing, had the control over the community spaces, if they were able to organise mental health support, if they had solid community infrastructure that could respond to and intervene in incidents of domestic violence, that could de-escalate, get someone to a place of safety. What I'm describing is what abolitionists call transformative justice. Like Shanice was saying, getting to the root of the problem. Not punishing it after the fact, not waiting till the violence has already happened, trying to prevent it, and when it does happen, actually intervening in a way that gets to the root of the problem. When we punish after the fact, I'm talking about getting to the conditions of why it happened in the first place. If it happened due to social isolation, we respond with a community contact. If it happened because there's no safe housing, we find safe housing to prevent it from happening again. We make it clear to perpetrators that the community knows what is going on and it will intervene every single time. And we'll offer perpetrators to support to change as well. I just want to finish by saying that, sorry, I'm feeling a bit emotional. I think that what we're starting to see is that there has been a really big societal shift in the way that people see policing, and it's become no longer tenable for the police to claim that they are the people to go to respond to domestic and sexual violence. And that really shifted after the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. And more people are coming around to the idea that investing in policing to solve gendered violence is a total contradiction. The police are the violence. That's why over half of Londoners now believe that the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist and sexist. So I really believe we have fertile ground for dismantling those systems of violence, dismantling police, and instead investing in our communities in the way that I genuinely believe prevents the kind of violence that happened in my community. And I think people are starting to see that more and more. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, that was fucking powerful, wasn't it? Griff, do you follow that?
Yeah, I think it's quite hard. It's quite hard to follow that.
It's all right, it's all right.
Well, no, I mean, I first of all definitely want to massively echo what's been said. I don't think there's a better way to say what's been said. And so I'm going to speak on two very much related but slightly different elements of the broader abolition and policing kind of area. One of them is an example of local abolitionist organising. Another one is an important element that underpins a lot of what is going on in policing and criminal justice today, and an abolitionist response to that. So an ongoing impact of austerity, of the policing that we're seeing today, the policing response, is the use of the underpinning of that policing response by data and new technology, surveillance, monitoring, databases, the use of data for predictive analytics, profiling, and that might sound a bit removed. As soon as some people start talking about this kind of thing, it's very easy to switch off and it sounds boring, but a lot of this is underpinning the police responses, and increasingly so. The use of data and technology is presented as both cost-efficient and time-efficient. It means they don't have to invest in actual police officers. And it also means that they can use these new forms of data and technology as justification for existing and future racist and violent approaches. Surveillance, monitoring, data analysis, it gets presented as kind of a magic solution to any and all social problems. An example that we've heard that Shanice touched on is the use of face recognition surveillance, which is being used as an attempt to kind of police and criminalize the way out of the cost of living crisis. It's a criminalization of the cost of living. It's using the use of the surveillance technology to do it. It's a collaboration between the police and private companies to utilize a very intensely invasive surveillance technology in retail, in shops, at a time when obviously people are taking things they need to survive. And this collaboration has taken the form of police handing over their police records to retail. And just earlier this week, the policing minister talked about giving access to the passport photos database. So police could run facial recognition in collaboration with shops through the passport database. And there's 45 million images on the passport database. Everyone who's got a passport has the image on the passport database. I'm not trying to scare so much as it's not happened yet, but that's something which is being talked about. And the aim is, the specific stated aim is for them not to catch any form of serious criminals, but to target specifically shoplifters and burglars. The private company that's doing that is called FaceWatch. On the advisory council for that company is someone in the House of Lords called Jonathan Evans, who's a former MI5 director. So we've got like a very clear link between the establishment, police, and private companies. There's a kind of they're being given, this private company that's doing this is being given legitimacy in Parliament by the government. It has an establishment ally in that sense. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, the way that face recognition surveillance has been used is being used. They've targeted people wanted for very low-level crimes. Historically, they've used it against protesters. They've also used it to target people with mental health issues. So people who are known to the police to have mental health issues, they have put this on a database that they have then used at public events to find people. And of course, the usual police databases that they're using are going to massively, disproportionately overrepresent black and brown people and people from other minoritized ethnic backgrounds. So that's just one example, a very kind of present example of how surveillance technology in policing is being used in this area. But as a more kind of the role is much, much broader than that. And to use kind of a blunt example, Chris Carver, who was shot by police last September, the officer who shot him is the person who's ultimately responsible, as well as the institution of policing. But within that, there was a very clear. His death was also the nexus, the site of racist and authoritarian state surveillance. The use of police databases and also kind of shadowy predictive algorithms assessing people's risk of criminality. And I'll explain why that is. The reason that Chris Carver was stopped in the first place was because of a police automated number plate recognition system. So a camera system that they have in police cars and also on the street, which recognize number plates. And that system told police that the car that he was driving had a firearms incident linked to it. So the police officers stopped him on the basis that he was the person driving the car. They didn't know who he was, but that the person driving the car was linked to a firearms incident. And they saw a young black man driving it, and then presumed on the basis of that he was armed and dangerous. So in addition to the officers' own existing prejudices, the information that they were given that this car was linked to a firearms incident will have influenced every subsequent interaction that followed. The hard stop where they blocked his car in, and then when they shot him. So that's quite like at the kind of the worst end of the scale, but it's a very real, tangible, just a recent example of how policing and violent policing and deadly policing is being justified via data-driven approaches. Now the concepts beneath them are absolutely not new. All it is, all this kind of increasing data gathering, collection, monitoring, and use in policing, it's ultimately just exacerbating and reinforcing the existing criminalization and violence against black people and other racialized people. And it's extremely widespread. The use of these increasing databases, people will have heard of the gangs matrix in London. But police forces all over the country are doing their own similar initiatives. They're collecting information, they're profiling people, profiling people as whether they're likely to commit crime in the future, whether they're at risk of committing crime in the future. And yeah, those lists are sometimes linked to concepts of gangs. They're sometimes linked to whether they think people are likely to commit serious violence. Like all the kind of forms of alleged criminality that are becoming kind of moral panics, or that are a moral panic. You can bet the police will have some kind of database or list that they're working towards on this. And it's becoming like it's integral to the way that policing works now. The Met Police now have a chief scientific officer who they appointed just a few months ago, who's the first person they've ever had. And what is happening there is that these data-driven approaches they're repackaging that existing structural and institutional racism, but they're being used as justification for it. So existing police responses are being justified on the basis that they have this data about a certain area, a certain community, a certain person. And where that comes from is merely just like the historic racism and oppression of the police. Areas that have been over-policed, people that have been over-policed, that all gets collected up into police and crime records. Those police and crime records are not an accurate record of criminality, as far as that means anything, given its kind of social construction and state construction. That concept of criminality isn't even represented in police and crime records. It's merely the records of the people and the areas that are policed. So what that then means is, given that like this, this kind of approaches whereby policing of certain areas is justified on this historic data, they feed information about crimes in a certain area into their systems, and they say, oh, well, there's going to be crime in this area. All that leads to is a feedback loop of the same areas, the same people, the same groups being retargeted, and as I said, a reinforcement of those existing structures of oppression and racism. These police databases are inherently biased, especially in relation to race, class, and gender. It reflects those structural biases and inequalities. And that structural element is also compounded by the very deliberate focus of these databases and these algorithmic prediction systems on low-level street crime, on property crime, and on racist notions of gangs. So the reason that I say that is because, the abolition of these systems, of these uses of data and technology, are an important part of the wider spectrum of police abolition that we've already heard so much about, such kind of solid, unarguable critiques of. And we can't and shouldn't accept the use of these technologies, the use of data by police and other criminal justice institutions to surveil us, to profile us, to predict future actions, and ultimately to always target already targeted communities. In our responses to these, we have to be clear and unequivocal about them, that we want to abolish these systems, that we don't accept the use of facial recognition to target alleged shoplifters, that we don't accept gangs databases or predictive and profiling systems to allegedly predict someone or an area where crime is going to be committed in future. There are many different types of these systems. There's facial recognition systems. There's police using mobile fingerprinting, which often they profile people and they target on the basis of immigration. And those fingerprinting systems are linked to immigration databases. So on the streets, they can see someone walking down the street and think, oh yeah, maybe we're going to target this person and check their immigration status. So it's a convergence of policing, of the hostile environment, of enforcement generally in any and all environments. And they're using technology to do so. It's not necessarily new, but it's certainly increasing and becoming solidified and becoming, as I say, underpinning what we see, what we know as policing, and being used as justification by the police, because they can say, oh, well, we've got records of crime in that area. That area is where there's historically lots of knife crime. So they can justify it on that basis. Politicians can justify these racist, violent responses on that basis. And these systems are providing the suspicion, they're providing the reasonable cause, the justification for police intervention, whether that's to question someone, stop and search, arrest, or even, in the most extreme cases, as with Chris Carver, to shoot and kill. So that's one, I think, important element of policing that's worth thinking about. And I wanted to finish with a local kind of abolitionist response to policing. We've heard about Chris Carver, who was killed by armed police last September, but also mentioned people who were killed by other police tools, by tasers, which are, even officially by the people who make them, they're called less lethal weapons. They're known that they are lethal, they're just less lethal. You don't necessarily immediately die because of that. That's how they're sold by the companies that sell them. And recently, or at least in the last year, there's been a number of high-profile killings by police as a result of the use of tasers. We heard about Deji Omoshaw, who died in London. Another example was just recently in Birmingham, someone called Ayub Hassan Abdi, who was shot in his home by a taser, and he fell to his death. And an example I want to focus on is someone called Zadok Obatola, who was killed in Peckham in April this year by police who broke into his home while he was suffering a mental health crisis. And while he was on the balcony of his high-rise flat, they tasered him, and he fell to his death. So two of those examples are people who were tasered in their own homes and who fell to their deaths. Two of them are people who were suffering mental health crises. And it may sound, I appreciate that, we've had a lot of intense emotional things here, and I just want to try and, draw out what can be done there in a local sense. We've heard about kind of wider national high-level critiques of it, but what people can do in a local sense. And in Southeast London, a local cop watch group has been organising around the death of Zadok, the man who was tasered in his home. That happened because he was suffering a mental health crisis, because he was on his balcony and he was shouting, and his neighbours didn't know what to do. There was, an absence of kind of, people don't know what to do when someone is in intense distress sometimes. And because in an absence of any alternative, his neighbours called the emergency services, and they sent the police. And the police broke into his home and, as I said, tasered him on his balcony. The reporting around his killing in April was patchy, with very little information shared. His name wasn't shared. There was no one advocating for his life. There was a few local news reports on it. And this reached, local networks, cop watch groups. And we tried to find out more about what happened. There was nothing in the news, so the only answer was to go and speak to organise and speak to the residents of the estate where he died in Peckham. because here was a black man killed by the state, and there was it's seemingly no one advocating for his life. No obvious family, friends, or networks who were advocating. And that is a brutally sad thing, to have someone's death go unchallenged, for someone to die in the dark in that way. So the Cop Watch decided to try and organise meetings with residents to find out more about what happened, to understand what could be done about this, and discuss what support they might want, and how to respond, how to challenge, to make sure that this person, to Zadok, that his death was not unchallenged. So, we flyed all of the flats and houses on the estate and started holding kind of regular meetings with the residents. It took time. It took a lot of effort, energy, and time to build that trust, to start getting people, because people were wary about what was going on. There was a lot of suspicion. There was ultimately a very serious kind of collective trauma around what happened. Everyone there, the people who were there on that night, they knew about it. There was a lot of noise. There was police. People talked to each other. They knew about what happened, but there was no certainty. No one knew what to do, what the right response could have been, what the right response was to do now. And there are no easy answers, certainly. So it took a while to build trust and establish relations, but eventually we as a group managed to speak to some residents, including people who knew him, and found out his name, found out some details about his life. He was quite an isolated figure. He didn't have, at least to the residents, family and friends that they knew of him. He was estranged from his family, and they knew him as someone who was quite quiet and reserved. There are many people like that in society. This is a story of not just police violence, mental health, but also isolation and an intersection of all of those things. So finding out that information was important, and then we spoke to the residents about what they would like to do and what action that could be taken. They talked about doing a vigil, some form of recognition of his life that residents could be involved in, that they could pay their respects, but also about demands. What could happen as a result of it? What could be done to make sure that didn't happen again? So, along with the residents, we discussed and agreed a set of collective demands. First of all, that he be named, because he hadn't been named up to this point, as well as answers why it took months, and by this point it was something like 4 or 5 months later after his death. There was no name out there. That the use of tasers be stopped, that there's no more police use of tasers as lethal weapons, and that there were alternatives to police involvement in mental health crisis. And we spoke a lot at these meetings, and we spoke about what could have been done, how people themselves might have had the confidence and the knowledge to intervene themselves in a way that kept this person safe, that made them feel safer, that may have been able to de-escalate it. And it's not to say that it would have done, but certainly breaking into the house and tasering someone is not the way to deal with it. And finally, and now this one is maybe a bit questionable in the context of abolition, is one of the demands was the cops being named and fired. That was something that came from the residents, and we wanted to respect that and support that. There's an argument that isn't going to address the ultimate problem, being the institution and the structure of policing, but this was something that meant something to the residents, that there be some form of accountability for what happened. So we obviously wanted to support that. And we also wanted to make noise about it. So as well as this vigil, we wanted to demonstrate about it. So we organised a march from the site of his death, from the vigil to Peckham Police Station, through the centre of Peckham. So that's what we did, and it was only last weekend. We held a vigil, we gave space to residents to share their feelings, to speak, to lay flowers, to write messages of support, for there to be a physical space, a site of remembrance, but also for there to be this emotional remembrance of him as well. And then we marched through Peckham to Peckham Police Station, where we held, where we had speakers and where people spoke to demand justice, including other people from allied campaigns. And we had really good feedback from the residents. They really appreciated the space. For some of them didn't, not all of them came on the march, most of them did, but not all of them did. Some of them just hung back and wanted to have a quiet moment to themselves. But I think all in all, it was very important to recognise his death, for people themselves to be able to process it, so there wasn't a way of trying to deal with this collective trauma that existed in this space. That was just a start for us. There were certainly more things to do. We want to continue recognition for what happened. We want to kind of continue that seeking of justice to make sure that his death, his life, and then his death is remembered. So I hope that kind of provides some useful thoughts and examples. Concrete things that could be done. Join your local cop watch group. Think about police intervention. Go to a police intervention training if you can. There's one tomorrow at 10:30 in here. And challenge police exercises of power if you can, and try and think about care not cops, community intervention when there's mental health crisis. If you see someone who seems like they might need some support, you providing that support could prevent someone else out of an unfortunate ignorance calling an emergency services, which could escalate the problem. So there's some kind of concrete things that we can all do on a micro level, as well as these kind of high level, national campaigns and approaches. Thank you.
Cheers, great. We were meant to have another speaker, Lolo Jones. They're ill, I'm afraid, so just those. Cheers. We're going to have questions now. If anybody has anything they'd like to raise, any points or questions for any of the speakers. Yeah?
It's less of a question.
What's that? Is that what? Yeah?
Yeah, no, it's less of a question, I think, more of an extension of what's been talked about, a lot about mental health, and there's a massive intersection between policing and mental health, I think. Yeah, thank you. Because it's something that people, it's quite a scary experience when you haven't had that experience, but how to de-escalate that situation. I have worked in mental health, so I understand that. I just wanted to kind of point people in the direction of an organisation called the Campaign for Psychiatric Abolition, who are campaigning for the end to psychiatric detention, voluntary detention of people as a result of their mental health, viewing that as a further form of policing and incarceration. And on there, they've got a link tree in their Instagram bio, and it's got lots of really useful resources for kind of helping direct you if you find yourself in a situation where you come across someone who is experiencing distress, and just some nice points to guide you in that situation, because it can be overwhelming, and it is something that takes a kind of practice and skill. Thank you for all of your words today. They were useful and powerful and inspiring. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. And just really briefly, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that helps is a mentality shift. People think people who are going through mental health crisis are scary and going to harm them. What you have to remember is the person going through mental health crisis is more likely to be harmed by someone who's not in crisis than you are to be harmed by the person in crisis. And that can sometimes be difficult when someone's presenting in a way that feels quite foreign, and they're maybe saying things that feel quite scary, or they're behaving in a way they're not quite there. That can be quite scary. And if you haven't got experience in those situations, that can feel difficult. But just remembering that actually the vulnerable person in that situation is the person going through mental health crisis, and that actually there are tools and techniques, as mental health first aid, for example, that you can equip yourself with to be able to respond in those situations.
This might be outside of your particular background and expertise, which would be fair enough, but how does the law itself, the institution, meet with the things you discussed, policing, and so practically it's on the ground, but then once it goes to court, how can we use that as a system of abolition or in the same thing, or promotion of the bits that...
Are you looking for justice from the legal system?
I guess.
Does anybody join?
Sure. Yeah. You might be waiting a long time. How does the law intersect? So, maybe what is, again, another thing that's been underpinning, I think, a lot of what we've said is, unfortunately, laws which justify and allow a lot of the racist, violent policing and criminal justice responses to social issues. There's been a raft of criminal legislation, anti-protest laws, laws criminalising public space, laws introducing more stop and search powers. Unfortunately, the law is the site of a lot of this oppression. It's justified and allowed by the law. So I think like what is part of this abolition list is abolishing those laws. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, the Public Order Act. Public Order Acts going back to the 1980s. These are existing issues that have a long history in the law, unfortunately. There's people being tried, or arrested, tried, prosecuted on laws going back 50, 60 years. I don't know if this is maybe a slightly outside example, but right now there's women being prosecuted under an act from 1861 for violence against the person for procuring abortions. That's how far oppressive laws are going back. It's maybe no surprise that they go back that far, but they still exist today. They still have an impact today. And there is a long list of these violent oppressive laws which are being used to kind of uphold all of the problems that we've spoken about. So I think seeking justice in the police or the criminal justice system, is going to be waiting a long time.
So I want to add to that, but also add some touch of nuance, because I do agree with absolutely everything you said there. So the law is a tool, and I think we should see it as a tool. And some tools you can sharpen, and some tools are just broken. And so if we look at, for example, if you look back through the history of the creation of race as a concept, it was actually the law that was the first and primary tool that created race. Because, before if we look at kind of slavery and indentured workers, where you had white indentured workers and you had black African slaves, who by and large understood themselves as having a relationship to slave labour, as opposed to a relationship to themselves through the colour of their skin. And when Bacon's Rebellion happened, what was the result? How did they break up the capacity for those indentured workers and slaves to unite? They introduced new laws that gave the white indentured workers more rights than the black slaves, therefore creating an allyship between the white indentured workers and the white plantation owners. And boom, you've got the invention of race as a social and political category. So that is an example of the law being used as a tool of oppression. There are, for example, if you look at the work of David Renton, who's a housing lawyer, has done some incredible work using the law to aid his clients and to get, really good outcomes in the kind of the housing space for his clients. So I think, where there are opportunities for moving us in a progressive direction using the law, and I think that the most pertinent case at the moment is the charge of the officer who killed and murdered Chris Cabba. Although we understand that one officer going to prison isn't going to solve police violence, actually there's a whole host of reasons why it's incredibly important that that police officer was charged and is taken through trial and maybe is found guilty. There's a whole host of reasons why that's a good thing. Ultimately, that's not going to be where we end police violence once and for all. We look at the US, for example, they've had quite a few successful murder convictions and manslaughter convictions, but their rates of, killing black people in the streets hasn't gone down. So the question for me is always not whether one thing is the be-all and end-all, the route to revolution, the route to liberation. The question is always, how can we use this thing to progress our aims? And if we can't, don't bother. I think we need to abandon the idea of things being inherently and good in and of themselves. The law isn't this precious thing. The law is fundamentally a tool that was invented and continues to be used by the ruling class. At the same time, we also live in a situation where those members of the ruling class are themselves breaking the law quite brazenly and openly. Partygate, for example, not a good thing that happened. It's not a good thing that politicians can create laws and then themselves not be accountable to them. So I don't want to poo-poo the idea of, the law's oppressive, let's not bother. But it's not going to be the central thing that leads us to liberation. So just asking sensible questions about, can this help us, can it not? Is it going to progress the struggle? Is it not? If it does, cool, let's pursue it. If it doesn't, let's look at more practical and pragmatic avenues.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to think of it in like a straightforward way, the law is not a tool of liberation, but a tool of mitigation. It can sometimes, as Shani said, be used as a tool of mitigation to use that metaphor, to blunten some of the worst excesses, but it's never going to be a tool for liberation. And there's that overuse, but rightly so, Audre Lorde quote, which is, the master's tools will not bring down the master's house. So it won't be, the law can't be used for liberation, but there can be some mitigation. Like every day there's immigration lawyers who are preventing deportations via the law. Sometimes that requires direct action, but a lot of the time it's people working very, very hard using that law. Problem is that every day there's a new case, there's a new struggle, but they're still fighting against the system using those same tools.
I'd just add that I guess the way that I think about this is, broadly speaking, I agree with kind of what's been said, that broadly speaking, the law and investment in the rule of law is not going to bring us any kind of liberation or social justice. But there are, using the law as a tool in certain instances, alongside lots of other tools like organising, unions, building power, all of those things. Ultimately, what the question that I think Shanice is also getting at is this something that is going to put more power in our hands, or is it something that is going to give them more power or a veneer of respectability or whatever that is? I think you can interpret, the prosecution of the police officer who shot Chris Cabba in different ways. On the one hand, I think it is clearly something that they are doing. They've never charged a police officer with murder before, so they're clearly listening to the years of organising, and they're clearly shook that oh my god, all of these people organising, they have not been able to reclaim the police, they've not been able to reclaim their image after scandal, crisis after crisis, and this is a crumb that they're throwing to the public to say, yeah, okay, we've heard you, we can be accountable. So I do think that should be considered a massive win for the movement, because that is the organising, that's what that has achieved. And to a certain extent, it has put some power back in the hands of people, because what was the response from armed police officers? They threw a fit, and they handed in their guns and basically declared that they were going out on strike because if they can't shoot people unaccountably, they don't want to do their job. But ultimately, that's clearly whipping up more of a crisis. And I think what we have to be careful about is not accepting that as, okay, well, that's put something in our pocket in terms of power. We don't have to, if this guy gets convicted, that's it. No, we take that power, we take the fact that the police officers are shook about their job, and they're shook about the fact that they can't kill people unaccountably, and we push harder for more power. We don't accept it. So I think, there's different ways of interpreting the law and the use of the law, but fundamentally it's about, is this action worth pursuing to put some more power in our hands, and how do we push and push and push to get more of it?
Yeah, I was going to add as well, so over the last 12 years, I've been campaigning against the deployment of undercover police officers in the political protest groups. For the majority of that time, we've been doing a lot of legal action through that, whether that's bringing civil cases against the police, or now this ongoing public inquiry. And the legal methods of holding the police to account like that, they're not very effective. I don't think anybody really involved with that has any belief that these processes are going to achieve anything like justice or anything. But they act as an ideal springboard in order to campaign around the issue more generally. Without that framework of the ongoing, very slow disclosure and the ability to turn up and focus the mind by doing these things, it would be a lot more difficult to, particularly with something where it's historic, to keep that campaign rolling. So I think the legal process has been very useful, though it's entirely flawed, and there's never going to be an outcome that would ever be acceptable that comes from it. It's still worth pursuing. Anybody else? Yeah?
It's loud enough, can you hear it? Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. I don't know if I can even formulate my question because I was just so moved by it. Had to go out and get some fresh air. I work in the VOG sector. That's been fairly recent for me. I started in February of this year, and in previous workplaces I've been very involved in my trade union organizing. I'm part of the charity workers branch of the IWGB, and I'm trying to think through now with other interested colleagues ways to build in abolitionist principles into our trade union organizing at Solus from the beginning. And I wanted to, the beginning of this wave, but that was already the wave that got smashed anyway. I wanted to hear more about experiences you've had doing this, or where I can look to for resources, and just a space to talk about the link between bringing the principles that you've talked about today into the VOG sector through grassroots union organizing.
You can talk about it.
So I am currently employed by Sebungos. I was on strike for 13 weeks, but I'm leaving. But I'm leaving, so if you want the juice of what happened in that strike, come to the session later where I'll be giving all the details. But I think it's relevant because that's a sector where you're often expected to have quite close relationships with the police because of safeguarding. And it can be quite tricky internally to kind of find ways to wiggle around. And I think one of the key concepts that can be helpful, two key concepts is harm reduction and abolitionist reforms. And I think abolitionist reforms can be summed up as, are there things that we can do that achieve the aims that we're looking for in terms of whether the work that we're doing with clients and kind of changing processes and systems to be better for clients, but that actually reduce our contact or reduce the influence and power of carceral systems. So one of the things that, I've had conversations with colleagues about is, if clients are behaving violently, do we always have to call the police? And what are the consequences for us as workers with our internal policies, but also what are our statutory kind of obligations if we don't call the police, and what alternatives can we put in place in order to kind of help de-escalate situations, and what would be the consequences of those? Will we be unsafe if we do that, for example? And to be honest, the reality is a lot of the time the police, when you call them to an incident in a service, turn up a couple of hours later anyway, so you're forced in the day-to-day to come up with alternatives. So there's questions of looking at what is the kind of reality on the ground for workers in these services, and are there ways that you can make things better? So, for example, cool-down rooms, or training staff in restorative justice, or training staff in mental health, de-escalation and first aid. Are there practical things that you can put in place that mean you don't have to make that 999 call, but also importantly, you're not going to be put through a disciplinary for not making that 999 call, because there are safeguards in place that mean you meet your statutory requirements, the client is safe, you're safe, and nobody can say anything. So another way of kind of looking at that is harm reduction. And harm reduction is already, by the way, a concept that exists in the law. Homelessness services don't have to, there's no legal obligation to report clients that use drugs on our premises. We don't have to report that. In fact, because of the way the law works, often the only two things that we have to take action on are smoked opiates and cannabis, and there's a whole weird reason why that is the case. You have to take action on those two things, not necessarily calling 999, but kind of speaking to clients and getting them to leave the building, etc. But other than Class A drugs, you don't actually have to, by law, you don't have to report it, which is great because it means that all of our clients aren't going to end up in jail or in prison, and we can actually work with them and we can support them into routes of recovery. So these are concepts that already exist in our line of work. So it's about finding other routes to kind of harm reduction processes and methods and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely look at Abolitionist Futures. They have a lot of amazing resources on abolitionist reforms and how you can kind of, if you're involved in policy work in these organisations, or if you're at that manager level and you can set the culture of a service, you can, you can create new ways of doing things with these concepts in mind. A lot of our service managers, or some of our service managers, kind of on the creative side of things, are thinking of alternative ways of doing rent collection, for example, or alternatives to harmful behaviour. Instead of kicking someone out and they're homeless again, what kind of transformative or restorative approaches can we take to harmful behaviour whereby people can stay longer in their accommodation? So all of these things are examples of harm reductive abolitionist approaches to kind of doing that sector-based work.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think that this isn't something that I've fully thought through, because it's kind of a question in my mind as someone who's a trade unionist, and I really believe in the power of trade unions in terms of gaining power back into the working classes and into working class communities. And there's a bit of a difficulty. So like my background is like working in the domestic violence sector, and there's probably a complication as well in terms of like working in homelessness and working in charities generally, between like if you're organising as a worker, you know, but you're working on an issue that ultimately you want to see the end of, then you're kind of working hopefully towards seeing the end of your job. And like, I genuinely believe that like, when it comes to domestic violence, like I do think that industry needs to become deprofessionalised, you know? Like, and a lot of the answers that, you know, people were looking for at the beginnings, like the 1970s, like it's quite, you know, the domestic violence sector is a bit different from a lot of other charity sectors. It began in squats by feminists and survivors who kicked down doors and said, right, we've had enough. Like, we are going to negotiate a completely different relationship to society for women. Women shouldn't have to be in domestic violence situations and just sit there because their husband, you know, earns money. We're gonna find a way to be autonomous from the state and autonomous from our husbands, and we're going to go into squats, and that's how we're going to do it. We're going to become self-organised. And they didn't have money, they didn't have funding, they didn't have like grants, they didn't have any of those things. They just did it by themselves. And what is quite interesting is like those first refuges, you know, the first refuge in this country was in Chiswick. And this sounds kind of bonkers now, but in the same refuge where they had like this huge house where they literally never turned away any survivor that turned up, they had like mattresses staking all the way up the like, you know, the floors and the hallways everywhere. And they also had the perpetrator program downstairs once a week. Which to us sounds like, why would you bring the perpetrators there? But they were really genuinely trying to figure out, how are we going to end domestic violence? How are we actually going to bring this to an end? Like, these are the things, the perpetrators need some kind of space to be held accountable, to change their behaviour, and the survivors also need somewhere safe to stay. They didn't have any, you know, two spaces to work with, so they tried to do it in the same place. Do you know what I mean? And it was only through much later, when the sector became deeply professionalised, that we see a lot of the skills. You know, the women who were in those refuges were using mutual aid. So if one woman had already been at the refuge for 2 months, then she was the one that was going to go to the woman who's just turned up to the housing office, or to social services, or to claim the benefits. They used it through mutual aid. There wasn't a worker there to do that. And even down to, you know, the fact that when that industry, the sector became professionalised, before the refuges were like word of mouth through the women, through the network, and then suddenly there's a gate because we, you know, Refuge or Women's Aid have got the contract to run it, so we can't know like where to call up to see where there's a space. We don't know the numbers of the organisations necessarily. We have to have a password, and we have to have a job at Refuge or Women's Aid to be able to access that. We can't access that in the community anymore. And so there's a bit of a contradiction. Like, I support like the IWGB to organise. I think I don't necessarily fully know how, you know, what that means in terms of, you know, radical organising in the charity sector when you're trying to bring an end to that's the very reason why your job exists. I do think it is possible. I think we can ask those radical questions about what union organising looks like in that sense, and kind of deprofessionalising the industry that we're working in. I don't have the answer to that, but I think, I do think that looking back at some of the questions that they were asking when the domestic violence movement began, but also looking forward and looking at the situation that we're in now, and like what are the needs that survivors have now in the community, and how can we distribute the skills outwards and rather than gatekeep that. Do you know what I mean? So yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah, over there.
Touched on it some already, but I was interested in sort of the education around this. So obviously with like an institution like the bank, there's not a lot to be said about it other than it's bad and it's together. But with situations like with social workers visiting people, health visitors, and also maybe with like small rural police forces, police forces that mainly does traffic control. There's these institutions that are still kind of like putting people into systems and classifying people and discussing them in a room and saying what needs to be done. But like part of this is like limited meetings between like health visitors and midwives and social workers. And like I thought what they were doing was very good in a lot of ways. Like I'm glad that there are people that go and say, don't feed your child raw chicken, that's bad. But at the same time, it was a room for people talking about people in their absence, saying what was wrong about them and what's to be done. And it was very much like an institutional system for, I guess you could say, policing people, although obviously not quite. So, yeah, I guess my question is, where do you think those grey areas need to be kind of the beginning of where we build something new? What could be saved from existing systems?
Was there a question there as well at the back?
Yeah.
Hi. So my question kind of about like the whole, actually this is something that comes up in Australia, about the whole hearing consent thing and like how we do it. Because if I look at sort of like the police, like the map has its history, maybe like 1820s, created to like like striking workers to stop consent and stuff. Like it was basically made to stop like organised like communist parties and like socialist workers, people organising in their workplaces and factories and stuff. You know, it was at the First Revolution where lots of people were losing their jobs and all that. I probably didn't see the context so much. But this idea of like public consent that police only exist because of consent, not because of public consent, is kind of like influenced to speak about the police stopped having this approach of like violently attacking workers and violently attacking people because the public obviously were like, what? So it didn't work. And eventually the police kind of turned to this insidious thing like we thought this thing to protect us, and the manufacturing consent to talk about input to sort of like you know, they manufacture public consents that they get away with the same things that non-paid issues on the car. It's the same incredibly violent system that we just like learn and understand and okay. And talk about like, it's really important for us to withdraw public consent and talk about moving away from like protests become these massive like protests that happen in one moment and they kind of fizzle out like over 4 minutes around that and they feel that you know it's massive turnout. This is obviously a violent piece of system. Don't want to sound for it, come out and uncomfortable, but like, certainly those systems out really fast. The question sounded like, how can you like withdrawing public consent thing, or like withdrawing consent when we kind of don't know how it's like, it is becoming more and more obvious to more people that the police is a violent system, but like, every single time something happens, the police just sort of like, oh, we will restore public trust, we will restore public trust. how like what this world where like it's such an insidious thing, like it's not obvious that like you're the person, it's like the other person is like what it takes to just like organizing you to just go off and make people like what's actually doing and like just proving how it's consent, really hard and it's
I can talk now. You've got 1 minute left.
I think it might even be less than a minute. To be honest, I don't think there's a big formula here because I think largely the police are doing that work for us. Not because they're stupid, they might be, but because there's an inherent contradiction within policing itself, and it's that's being exposed. And that inherent contradiction, which we touch on in the book, is the fact that they need our consent in order to legitimize themselves, but at the same time, the world we live in requires them to be consistently and increasingly using force against the very people that they require consent from. So, the Clapham Common Vigil is an incredible example of that. You've got a constituency of people, white women in London, who theoretically should never have been the victims of the kind of public brutal violence that we saw on the 13th of March 2021. And yet, because the Home Secretary at that time didn't want to be accountable to public opinion, wanted to clamp down on protests, and because of the environment around the pandemic and cost of living crisis that was emerging, because of that reality, the government, the state at that time actually needed the police to do exactly what they did to the women at Clapham Common. So these kind of contradictions are revealing themselves more and more and more. At the same time that Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Commissioner, is saying, the Met has just changed their 5 values and one of them is inclusive, right? And at the same time that they're doing that, he's arguing that the police officer that shot Chris Cabba, the CPS and the IOPC. So what's interesting is these divisions that are actually opening up between the police, the CPS and the IOPC. He's gunning for them because he doesn't believe that the police accountability should work in a way that means police officers get charged with murder when they murder someone. So at the same time as them being inclusive, he's also arguing for killing black people and for that to be something that you can do with impunity. So these things are just becoming clearer and clearer and clearer. So I don't necessarily think we need to, get our brains together in a room and trying to figure out what are the ways that we can get people to withdraw consent. Although that kind of theorising is important, actually we need to be sharp and expose the contradictions that are glaring in front of our eyes already. I think that's kind of the route. Because the police... So I'll finish with this. Baroness Casey's report, that seminal explosive report that Mark Rowley publicly supports, said in it that if the police don't reform within the next few years, we should consider disbanding the Metropolitan Police. This is a report from a baroness. That would have been something unthinkable to be in the Scarman report or the McPherson report that is in the Casey report. And I think, just picking up on these things, constantly pushing the narrative, I think is the best thing that we can do.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody for coming. We've run out of time. If you do have any more questions you want to speak to any of us, just come and find us here.
Well, our book as well, if you want.